Hello everyone and welcome to the first session of Reading Simondon on the mode of existence of technical objects taught by Cécile Malaspina. This survey seminar will offer a collaborative close reading of Gilbert Simondon's book on the mode of existence of technical objects, first published in 1958. This has been a seminal work in the philosophy of technology. In the text, Simondon challenges the conventional dichotomy between humans and machines, arguing for an emancipation of technical objects from the enslavement of mere utility in the cultural sphere and restoring the dignity of technical objects through an unprecedented philosophical account of their modes of existence and evolution. Cécile Malaspina's own English translation, published by Univocal in 2017 with the help of John Rogove, is the first official translation of this major work. This seminar will feature two guest lectures by contemporary philosophers who will discuss the importance of Simondon for their own work. In the other sessions, Malaspina will delve with the students into key parts on the mode of existence of technical objects. Cécile Malaspina is the author of an epistemology of noise and principal translator of Gilbert Simondon on the mode of existence of technical objects. She is directrice de programme at Collège International de Philosophie and visiting research fellow at King's College London and the University of the West of England, where her program for the CIF is hosted by the Department of French and Philosophy, respectively. She is contributing editor to Angilaki, a journal of the theoretical humanities, commissioning editor for the independent publisher Copy Press, and guest editor at Nature, Humanities, and Social Sciences Communications. Cécile Malaspina obtained her doctorate in epistemology, philosophy, and history of the sciences and technology from Paris 7 Denis Diderot, and her master's in contemporary French philosophy and critical theory from the Center of Research in Modern European Philosophy in the UK. Before turning to philosophy, she trained as an artist, art historian, and curator. Her main interest lies in the normativity of concepts, especially with regard to the aesthetic and ethical implications of conceptualism, contingency, and uncertainty. We're also honored to have in our seminar three exceptional guest speakers. Nandita Bisa-Omilamfi specializes in critical philosophy theory, continental philosophy, and speculative political theory, especially the work of Friedrich Nietzsche and the post-Nietzschean, as well as the history of political thought. Her particular areas of interest include post-humanism, information, digital warfare, and critical surveillance, terrorism studies. Erin Manning is a professor in the Faculty of Fine Arts at Concordia. She is also the founder of Sense Lab, a laboratory that explores the intersections between art practice and philosophy through the matrix of the sensing body in movement. Current art projects are focused around the concept of minor gestures in relation to color and movement. Art exhibitions include the Sydney and Moscow Biennale, Glass House, Vancouver Art Museum, McCord Museum, and House of World Sculptures, and Galactica, a gallery. Publications include for a pragmatics of the useless, the minor gesture, always more than one, individuation dance, relationscapes, movement, art, philosophy, and with Brian Massumi, Thought in the Act, Passages in the Ecology of Experience. Brian Massumi is a Canadian philosopher and social theorist. Massumi's research span the field of art, architecture, cultural studies, political theory, and philosophy. His work explores the intersection between power, perception, and creativity to develop an approach to thought and social action, bridging the aesthetic and political domains. He is a professor in the communication department of the Université de Montréal. Cécile, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you very much for this lovely introduction. I also wanted to say that Nandita and Dan Melamfi, together with Ninian Melamfi, were the initial translators of a kind of non-official or non-sanctioned by the stakeholders translation that was super influential for making Simondon really accessible to English-speaking readers, and it's just fantastic. I've always wanted the opportunity to meet them and talk, and so this seminar is it. So you'll see when we go through the texts, especially through the introduction to individuation in light of the notions of form and information. You know, translation is always a negotiation and a kind of learning process. So yeah, there was definitely a dialogue that was implicit and that is still to be had with the Melamfis that I'm looking forward to very much. And you'll see as we work through it, translation is a work in progress that never ends. And also, as I think not many people are aware is that it is often a hugely collective work. So there were editors involved that closely read the text, that each contributed to the decisions that were taken. There were co-translators involved. There were previous texts that need to be sourced. There were uncertainties. As you know, as a young scholar, when I encountered Simondon's work, I literally learned my way into Simondon's thinking through the translation. Think of people like Hippolyte, who actually learned German by translating Hegel. So imagine the double whammy of learning German and finding your work into Hegel's work. So yeah, I want you to think that underneath this first reading together of the mode of existence of technical objects is this translation dialogue, multipolar dialogue that is ongoing and will likely see future iterations of, new editions of translations. I'm saying this also because it is a text that many philosophers I met along the years have, also well-known philosophers, great academics who said, oh yes, I must get into Simondon. And I started reading him, but I couldn't really wrap my head around him. I have even heard from some of Simondon's contemporaries that Simondon's contemporaries felt there was something very exciting and important happening. There were conversations about his work happening, and yet I think everyone was a little bit gobsmacked by a work like the mode of existence of technical objects that erupts in philosophy, dealing with classical philosophical texts in a way, or by diving into the nitty-gritty details of technical objects like light bulbs and engines and so forth. So there is then also translation going on here between a kind of technical vocabulary, something that an engineer might be more at home with. Many engineers have, in fact, also, I don't know if many, but there is, for instance, one colleague of mine, Yağmur Denizhan, in Turkey. She's been responsible for introducing the thought of Simondon into kind of Turkish reading groups. And as an engineer, she has really both words, if you like, translating the thinking of the engineer and the thinking of the philosopher. But often if you come only from an engineering and not a humanities background, you would be just as baffled by reading Simondon. So the stretch between quantum physics and Plato is not an easy one to get to bridge, and requires its own type of translation. Kemal might help us with the quantum physics eventually when we get to it. So what we're going to do is, I hope you have looked at the syllabus. What I want to do is preempt this getting stuck in the technical details by reading on the mode of existence of technical objects, not only backwards, starting with the third section. Let me see if I can manage this screen share now in a bit. But first I want to finish my thought because I tend to lose my train of thought. So not only starting with the third section, going to the second and then the first, but starting with the introduction to the individuation book, which isn't technically speaking on the menu for this close reading seminar, but which I think provides the widest frame within which we can situate in the end all the why it matters to talk about the nitty-gritty of a light bulb, for instance, the fact that it isn't just a kind of, I don't know, hobby engineer, obsessive, interest in the details, but that it matters that you look at the details of things. And I'll just give you, because this isn't really a kind of Discovery Channel, I'll give you the spoiler straight away. This is because the entire method of thinking through individuation must not resolve in one that hovers with general concepts above the hexate, the singularities of what it is that individuates. So when we start reading backwards, we start with the widest bracket, with the most general terms, and we narrow progressively down to the overall narrative within which the interest in the nitty-gritty of the evolution of a particular lineage of technicity happens, and why it is that we should be interested in rocker switches and things like that. Okay, So I get really flustered with PowerPoints and screen sharing and stuff, so just bear with me for a second. Okay. I think we'll do like this. Okay. Now, what do you see? Do you see the first page of the introduction?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Still flustered. Heart beating. I don't know what it is that technical procedures like this, like PowerShare, PowerPoints and screen sharing, actually like it scrambles my concept brain. Because I wanted to also, have you got each of you, have you got the PDF of the mode of existence in front of you on your own screens? Is there someone who doesn't have it? Do you all have it? You need to put your hand up or say something if you don't have it. Okay, I mean, do you have the PDF of the
Oh no, apologies. I do have it.
Okay, cool. Because then just briefly look at the table of contents. So here we have on the mode of existence of technical objects. It says introduction, part 1, genesis and evolution of the technical object. Part 2 is man and the technical object. Part 3 is the essence of technicity. And then look at the subheadings of this. Here we have chapter 1, the genesis of technicity, chapter 2, technical and philosophical thought. And chapter 2 is relations between technical thought and other species of thought, other kinds of thought. And then chapter 3 is technical and philosophical thought. So we're going to start with this in the subsequent sessions, but I just wanted to kind of recall this in memory before we head into the introduction of the complementary thesis, which was, these are two so the mode of existence of technical objects and the individuation book were both a main thesis and complementary thesis that Simondon submitted in 1958 as his for his doctoral diploma, if you like, or his doctoral degree. In France at the time, this happened 10 years after teaching already. And so this is probably, it's not something to intimidate people writing a PhD now, thinking, oh, I'm never going to write something like this. It's a slightly different kind of historical approach to writing a PhD dissertation. So going into the text now of introduction to the individuation book, Individuation in Light of the Notions of Form and Information. What I want to do here is understand the stakes of where Simondon situates his philosophical method, and branching from the method, the necessity to reform what we understand by a philosophical concept, what it is that we have concepts of, i.e., what is the unit of being or becoming that we have a concept of? Is it a kind of substance that has a definition according to characteristics that are essential to it, or is it rather the understanding of a schema of individuation, which, if you like, underlies not something like a logic, not something like a dialectic, but rather a kind of operational schema that underlies the becoming of being and the becoming of beings in the plural, and which leads from this most general type of schema necessarily and without loss. And this is the important thing, this is not a reductive theory. So you have a fundamental schema, but it leads to an understanding of the singularity without loss, of the fine granularity of the individuals, be they technical, physical, biological, psychosocial, that are the topic of your philosophical analysis. So let's start with this now. You're in the way here. I don't know where to put okay, this is better. Can I perhaps just ask briefly, has everyone had has anyone had a particular difficulty with the text before we start? Anything that kind of jumps out where you, okay, Morgan, hello, by the way.
Hi, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you as well.
Yeah, I mean, well,
Yeah.
I don't really have anything in particular. I just thought that it was like specifically dense, and I think it was a very good entry point to try to understand the following text that we had to read, like as a sort of, I guess, I think for me it was just very important to try to understand it, just to better understand what is going to be dissected later in the other text that we had. But I found it extremely dense, also specifically in terminologies. Like there were a lot of words that were not in my vocabulary or repertoire, which I looked into, but yeah, it's not an easy first read for me, to be fairly honest.
Okay, I'm really grateful actually for this comment, because the kind of little spiel I gave you on the translation is really aimed at this, which is that there is parts of the text of the introduction, rereading it now, the one of the individuation book by Taylor Atkins, which is a monumental undertaking. I don't even know how he did this. It would have taken me a lifetime. It's such a crazy book to translate. But also the translation between all the different fields. The people who read Simondon the most aren't always people who are trained in classical philosophy, who will know their Aristotle or recognize their Leibniz. A curiosity of philosophical texts written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in France is that part of showing your if you know as a philosopher that you know your repertoire is that you didn't need to reference directly. If you talk about the concept, for instance, it is understood you're talking about Leibniz's idea of the concept in this text in particular. Talk about intuition, it is understood that you're talking about, that you're mentioning Bergson. So it is like a lot of these people had a kind of a type of qualification called agrégation, which means that you would have known the whole corpus of philosophy taught at the time, and that you could, like when you improvise on jazz themes, people would recognize where you're going with something. So this adds itself to the difficulty of translation when you go into a different historical moment where people read Simondon from coming from design, from architecture, from the arts, from literature, from also from philosophy, but not always with a kind of history of philosophy background the same way that the French had. So yeah, if there is perplexity, I think we can get through it, but I think it's a really good thing to acknowledge it, that this isn't a kind of individual failure of getting on with the dense French text, but that it is effectively on many levels of translation a difficult text to get into. Georgia, then hello again.
Hi. No, I mean, I wanted to say that, yeah, it's extremely dense, but the main thing that I noticed about reading it is that it's usually when you come across a really, really dense philosophical text, it's also extremely boring. And this is not, it's like incredibly elegantly written. It's beautiful. Like there's like the way that he describes these concepts is so poetic. It like takes on a kind of, I think this is a term that's used at the end of the other text that we read. It has like a mysticism to it, which is really yeah, kind of mind-blowing. And while reading it, I learned like 4 new words.
Amazing.
Which is, yeah.
And we'll probably learn new meanings of words that we thought we knew as well.
Yeah,
And
like yeah, definitely.
This mystical intuition is very interesting that you mentioned that, especially with regard to reading the mode of existence of technical objects backwards, because we are going from a kind of ground function in the individuation of philosophical thought that is happening in this book, in these 2 books. Simondon is, I think, rolling back the entire history of philosophical thought to where it went wrong, which is right at the beginning, basically. And the mystical aspect here is to look at the ground function of philosophy. What are the tensions What is the problematic situation that philosophy exists to resolve or has emerged historically to resolve? And yeah, so there's definitely kind of mysticism understood as attention to the functions of ground. What is the ground? What is the problematic ground from which philosophical thought as a principle of structuration, we'll talk about that word more later, or as a kind of dynamo of structuration emerges. Lynn, go ahead. And then probably we'll take one more and we'll get back to the introduction. I think it was Lynn and then Mitali, right? And hello and welcome to the seminar, you too.
Hi. Yes, I agree very much that it's very dense. It was actually also what I meant to say from the very beginning, that I think that's the principal difficulty of reading it, because I had to go back to each sentence like 3 or 4 times to grasp kind of what it points to. But also I think that's a text which tries to outline the problematic. So it doesn't just tell about Simondon's view, but he actually points quite precisely to the tradition, I think, or to the, like, let's say, constellation of thoughts which he tries to argue with, or which he takes into account. So he doesn't really name them, or he doesn't say who the representatives are, but at the same time, I think a lot of like text is dedicated to describing precisely what from where he comes from, and I appreciate it because I like reading texts which also give some context to these thoughts, and I think this particular text is doing it well. But at the same time, of course, there are a lot of concepts also which are not clear to me, or which are not like, there are certain words or certain phrases which I also outlined, which are still not quite graspable for my understanding.
No, I thank you for this comment also. And I want to say also, I want no one to hold back, especially I think one of the wealth, really the richness of the New Center is that people come from a lot of different disciplines with really deep knowledge of your own practices, which, you know, each of us would need a long time to learn and get into. So don't hold back if there are words that you think you ought to know. Like it took me, you know, I don't know, years, decades, maybe I'm only really understanding now what really people mean by ontology, what people mean by metaphysics. These are words that have that are thrown around in discourse like this, often with implicit references, or you know, that don't encompass necessarily the whole meaning of the word. So if we consider each of these terms as a moving frame of debate, it's a kind of a way of putting it that I think Gaston Bachelard used about scientific truth. I think he said something like science is a moving frame of debate. I also think each of the concepts that we mobilize in philosophical texts, all of the definitions are moving frames of debates, and depending on the debate, historical debate that you situate them in, different aspects of these concepts will be active, others muted, important, weighted, or discounted. So if there are words that aren't entirely clear, even if we've talked about them already, come back to them and say, what does he mean by epistemology here? What does he mean by ontology? Why is this metaphysics? Just to give you one background story, I initially had proposed when I was younger to do my PhD thesis on Simondon, and I said I want to do it about the epistemology in this book, the individuation book. And my supervisor then said, but this is not about epistemology, this is about ontology. And I was like, I don't know, I think it's about epistemology, but I don't know what these terms exactly mean. So it turns out it is about epistemology and ontology. And by the end of reading this introduction, I think most of these terms, to those who don't come with a background in classical philosophy, will be demystified and can become kind of tools, human-sized tools that we can use in our own thinking and export to different practices. I'll just quickly close the door here because it's freezing where I am. And then I come back to Mitali's question. Mitali, go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I mean, I completely agree with you. I think it's impossible in a text like this to separate epistemology from ontology in any case. There's such a beautiful and precise way Simondon constructs like does world building. And he is creating like as he puts forward his arguments, he also constructs that reality through the text. He demonstrates process philosophy through the text. His text itself is something where you can't treat ontology as separate from epistemology, because you are also simultaneously, while constructing the text, building a radical way of knowing, a different way of knowing, a different knowledge paradigm altogether, with reconceptualizing the object. And the way he begins with starting with halomorphism and substantialism being as the two fundamental traditions of philosophical thought that he's reworking, and then he goes from there. I felt it was such a useful way to start, because if you don't have, I mean, if you haven't read extensively in traditional philosophical canon, you can still start with this, because he is very, very clearly starting his world building from the ground up. And yeah, and I feel like in his later texts, it also becomes something where you can't separate the ethics of the work either. It's very, very hard to separate any of that within his work. It's whether the ethics of it or epistemology or ontology.
I think you're foreshadowing perhaps the most important point that Simondon makes in this introduction, right at the end of the introduction, where he says you cannot know things, you can only individuate thought in a manner that is analogical to the realities whose individuation you're trying to understand, and how this analogy is a form of communication that doesn't happen in ontologically separate worlds.
Yeah.
That's hopefully something that we can kind of peel apart from the text. And I also just want to say in parentheses, and why this is ethical, is that the way of knowing, if you hover above the thing that you want to know, and you stick immutable eternal concepts and essences on things and universals, the history from the unintended consequences of the Enlightenment has shown the extent to which things can go wrong when you do that. Whereas the ethical commitment to stay, to try and combine an understanding both of the forms of problem solving or tension resolution that happens in all processes of individuation, while at the same time never creating a kind of hovering discourse, but one that is steeped into the singularities of the problem each time that are solved by whatever entity that it is that's individuating, be it a kind of a lightning bolt in a storm, or a crystal forming in a solution, or the invention of the steam engine or whatever else. But we'll get to this. So these were really beautiful starting comments, and I want to take them also as an encouragement for each of you, and especially my favorite contributions come from people who normally feel shy to contribute. And I just want you to know that if a notion or concept is sticky, it isn't often just because we don't have the background knowledge, but there's an advantage in not having a background knowledge that makes us too comfortable with concepts. Because when you find them problematic, it's because your mind is still fresh enough to realize that they are problematical, and that problem then is productive of genuine philosophical thought. So don't hold back, and especially if you usually feel like you need to stay quiet because you come from a different field, or you just don't like talking in public. I know that this first session is going to be put on YouTube, but the subsequent sessions won't be. And so, yeah, and you'll be, I don't have favorites, but I do love, especially people who normally like to stay quiet if they feel comfortable to kind of chip in. It doesn't have to be a fully formed question, it can be just kind of saying, a scream, a primal scream is fine too. happen sometimes when you read philosophy. Okay, let's go back to the text. And we'll go through it. How do I... Okay, I don't know how to make this. Can I make this smaller? Yeah. First page. You can probably see that I've put a few little comments on the side. In red, I've put kind of the concepts or notions that are happening in this kind of mapping, like little key points, so that you know where we are in the text. So we're starting with the first paragraph of the introduction, and at the end of it, if we get through it fast enough, we'll look at the prospectus. The prospectus isn't a big worry for me now. It's just to give you a sense of what this mode of existence of technical objects roughly is going to be about. But I much prefer that we go into the idea of alienation and the enslavement of technical objects at the end of the process of understanding Simondon's thought, so that we don't risk a false friend. In translation is two words that appear to be the same in two languages but mean different things. But when Simondon talks about the emancipation of technical objects, I'm pretty sure he doesn't have in mind something. I mean, obviously he did, he died in 89. He wouldn't have been able, I think, he anticipated a lot of things, but I don't know exactly, I can't know for sure what he would have said about the development of what is, I think, wrongly called artificial intelligence. Certainly, reading Simondon this way will avoid thinking about the emancipation of artificial intelligence as something that is kind of enslaved by humans, although, potentially we'll still have to discuss this and talk about it. So let's look at the lecture structure, Simondon's introduction. In the first paragraph here, he talks about the ontological privilege of the individual. What he takes abreast here are classical models of individuation. The question of individuation is, how does the individual come about? Something to know in terms of background is that on the one hand, we're asking about something that you could call morphogenesis. How does something that has its own constitutive form, what is the genesis of this form? For instance, of an embryo or of a crystal or of a rock formation. So that could be one way of looking at the question of individuation, but that's not necessarily all that's going on here. In the history of philosophy, the question of individuation is more to do with levels of concepts. So how is something not a general instance of something, like you have an apple, you have two apples in front of you, they're both individuals. So they're both particular apples. They break down the kind of species and the genera and species into further particularities. But individuation is a really interesting concept, because it is about how this singularity of the apple that you have in front of you. Let's say you had two atoms that were formally identical, and yet each of these atoms would be individual in the sense that you can substitute them without knowing the difference between them. But conceptually, no, rather, in reality, there is an individuality, a singularity to each of these atoms. Does that make sense? So the two things we're thinking about here is, on the one hand, how does an individual come about in terms of ontogenesis? Think of the gestation of an embryo, think of an apple tree producing an apple, of a storm producing a lightning. The other question would be in categorical terms, going from the most abstract to the most specific. Yeah, wait, sorry, where are you? Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to ask about the word genesis. Maybe could we talk a bit, what does he imply by it exactly? Because that's something which troubled me the whole time.
Okay, if I may, I'll put that into parentheses, and we'll go deeper once we come to the Genesis bit. For now, think of Genesis. So it's not biblical Genesis, although the same problem is tackled in the biblical Genesis. How does the world come about? How do specific entities come about? how does, you know, this is not obviously about God creating the world, but it is nevertheless, it's bear in mind these two aspects of the problem of individuation. One, how does morphogenesis take place? How out of a kind of homogeneous background does form emerge? How does the individual come about as an entity? And on the other hand, the more formal question, how do you come from an understanding of real entities that is abstract, like the genera, to something that is more specific, like the species, to something that is so specific that you cannot be more specific, which is the individuality of something. The individuality is the singularity, this singularity of something. So these are the kind of two things to keep in the back of your mind. So in this first paragraph where Simondon lays out, he kind of goes all the way back to the two fundamental propositions that have been made in the history of philosophy about how individuals come about and how we understand their singularity, both of which fail. And in the first paragraph is about what they are and why they fail. So this is the classical models of individuation, one which focuses on substance and the other on, or both of which in different ways deal with substance, or hylomorphism, which is an Aristotelian way of thinking about form informing matter. And matter here being something passive that doesn't do anything of its own accord unless it is sublimated, if you like, by form, and form would be the kind of active principle. But we really don't know from Aristotle why form has the power to activate matter in this way. So the classical models of individuation, then the two major ones that Simondon has in mind is here is on the one hand Aristotle, on the other hand a tradition of thinking in terms of atomism that goes back to Democritus and the ancient Greek philosophers, and whose most prominent proponent in modern European philosophy would be probably Leibniz. Leibniz had a kind of theory of monadology, that where reality is constituted by these monads that each are a form of hexeity, well, I will get to that term in a minute, of singularities whose kind of aggregation form the kind of mathesis universalis, or the kind of would be that. So I'm running into a dead end here. Let me rewind. Let's keep it simple. There's two dominant models of being. One is substantialism, where the being is already unified and self-sufficient. That would be the atom. That would explain the emergence of individuals as an aggregation of atoms, as a swerve of atoms, as the ancient Greeks thought. And Simondon says, hang on a second, you're not really explaining how the individual comes about, you're just explaining how aggregates of individuals come about, because the principle of individuation, the atom that stands at the beginning of individuation, is simply given, and we don't know where it comes from. Where does the atom itself come from? The other way of approaching this, hylomorphism, where being results from the encounter of form and matter, suffers from a form of abstractness. The idea is that form informs matter, but we don't know exactly how form and matter interact. So both of these approaches presuppose that that there is something like a principle of individuation. And with principle, Simondon means something like un principe, what is at the beginning, a kind of first step, if you like, or first instance, and also the idea of something like a recipe. There is something before individuation starts that will determine how individuation happens and what types of individuals come about. And this is really where Simondon's the critique starts, is on the one hand to say you can't explain individuation by positing an individual as the first term, the atom, and you can't really explain individuation either by positing any form of predetermination of what is going to be the individual, a recipe. Let's say, for instance, in modern scientific theory might think of genetic determinism. So it's not about a telos, a recipe, or some form of predetermination of how the individual is going to come about. And why is Simondon saying this? He's saying that all these ways of looking at individuation fail because they don't have a clue, they don't even look for the operation, understanding the operation and the importance of the operation that gives rise to individuals. And also, as we will see, that gives rise not only to individuals, because once you look at this operation, you understand that the way that it folds reality into the becoming of an individual involves not only the individual, which will be a kind of side product of the process or of the operation, but involves also the system within which individuation takes place. So here, what are the philosophical stakes here in this first paragraph? It is challenging the Aristotelian hylomorphic model, so the kind of encounter of energy and matter. And it is challenging Leibniz's monads, or the kind of longer tale or longer historical tale of this in ancient Greek atomistic accounts of individuation. So just to recap, hylomorphism is a doctrine according to which things are composites of matter and form. So the word for matter here is something very interesting to look into. The term, the Greek term hylle, which is both matter or energy, and I believe it comes from the Greek word for wood, and the kind of underlying meaning is that which lends itself to becoming something else. And it has already a kind of technological connotation in the sense that wood would lend itself to becoming a table when the carpenter works it. So here's the idea of a kind of something that has the potential to become an individual if form is imposed on it. Substantialism is the philosophical view that treats the individual as an autonomous substance, one that has a definition, that has an essence, and a kind of autonomous identity. This is also something that Simondon critiques, because the operation, if we focus instead on the operation that brings about the individual, we have to think about the genesis of the individual together with the system that transforms itself in a manner that produces also the individual. That produces the individual and its milieu, let's put it this way. So what assumptions do we make when we treat the individual as a starting point for metaphysics? This is perhaps where you see a foreshadowing already of the ethical question, is what would be what is the deterministic outcome? What is the telos that a principle implies when it says, for example, the embryo has to become, a living organism? A living organism, if it is a telos, it has to be a certain way. If you look at it, if you put the operation first and look at the operation as itself being determined by the singularities of the system that it negotiates, you don't have a pre-existing telos towards which you evolve. I don't know if I'm explaining myself well here. Let's go to the second paragraph. So just to kind of reiterate my little notes here on the side, think when Simondon criticizes the notion of a principle, think about a recipe, think about a finality or a telos versus a theory of individuation without presupposed recipe, without presupposed finality, without presupposed telos, and even without a presupposed logic. There isn't a presupposed logic of individuation because each singular process of individuation brings forth its own logic, if you like. So logic and finality do not pre-exist, but are a consequence of an open and infinite process of individuation. And individuation, think of ethical and theological and political implications of interpretations of supposed human nature and its universals. So we're no longer thinking in terms of presupposed essences like human nature and universals. So here we talked about essences already. What he says is that the classical ways of thinking about individuation put the cart in front of the horse. So they start with the individual when actually you have to start with the system in which the individual emerges. So he reverses the traditional classical way of thinking about individuation. And instead, he wants to start from becoming. What does he mean by becoming? He means the becoming of being. So he's going all the way back, if you like, to an implicit critique of the Parmenidean and Platonist view of the world. There isn't a being that is fixed, immutable, and eternal, but rather it is, if there is an essence of being, it isn't what it is, but it is the fact that it is folding itself into a process of becoming. And this process of becoming is the various types of processes of individuations that unfurl from the becoming of being. So each individual process of individuation is in a way an unfurling of being unfolding itself. An unfurling of being with a big capital B. This is a major kind of metaphysical, speculative stance here, a theory that being itself is not eternal and immutable, or not immutable in an eternal sense, based on essences, but rather is something that it is in the essence of being to be in a process of transformation and becoming. And this process of transformation and becoming is the unfurling of all the different layers of individuation. So he advocates for a philosophy that starts from becoming rather than being, a dynamic conception of being in a really fundamental, metaphysical, speculative sense, and critiques any form of philosophical attempt to explain reality that would start from the finished individual and asking, how did this individual itself come about? Because when you do that, you consider a side effect of individuation, a side product of individuation, which is the individual, without understanding being as a whole or a system in particular within which individuation takes place. So what are the key ideas here? Classical metaphysics reconstructs individuation backwards. It begins from the individual seeking its cause, whereas Simondon argues on the opposite for a true or veritable ontogenesis that starts with the becoming of being in a kind of major metaphysical speculative sense, but also closer to home in whatever mode of being, if be it in physics or in biology or in, if you look at psychology, whatever it is that is happening in a process of individuation, involves a system that transforms itself such that part of the result of this transformation is the individual. And the other part is the system transforming itself, for instance, into a milieu that emerges with the individual and evolves alongside the individual. So one of the terms that you would have come across here is ontogenesis, the genesis of being then in a speculative metaphysical sense, and not just the formation of the individual, but rather the becoming of being. And this is something that will, I don't know if I think a bit later in the text, there's a real difficulty with translating this from the French. When in the French you say l'être, I think Simondon in this introduction meant being with a capital B in a speculative metaphysical sense, whereas the introduction here often suggests that it is the being, or the being in the sense of this individual that we're thinking about here now. We'll get to that in a minute, hopefully. Just one of the aspects of the difficulties of translation, if you like. There's also moments like that in my own translation that we'll come to later. So ontogenesis then is the genesis not only for Simondon, not only of a being, but of being in a speculative sense, and of a system where there was none, a system that comprises both the individual and its milieu that emerge together from a kind of pre-individual speculative being, emerge together and co-evolve. So as the individual transforms itself, also the milieu transforms itself, and so forth. He critiques Leibniz's understanding of the term hexaity, which would be a kind of pre-given principle of individuality, and he resists Aristotle's teleological orientation. So there's no final form or end goal that predetermines the panning out of a process of individuation. So we go to paragraph 3 now. So hexate, what is the term hexate is one that I've been thinking about a lot. And in this introduction here, you could think of hexaity as the unique characteristics arising from a singular process of ontogenesis. Think, for instance, of each tree. If you cut a tree sideways, for instance, the rings of the tree are each like a fingerprint. The singularity of the ways that the tree grows, also its undulations, are the result of the kind of process of individuation that is both the tree itself, that comprises both the tree itself growing and the geological, biological, meteorological conditions within which it evolves. So there is a uniqueness, a singularity deposited in the individual for Simondon that has something to do with this hexaity that isn't predetermined, that isn't an essence, an eternal essence that is merely embodied like it was in classical philosophy or in Leibniz. So hexaity, think about unique characteristics arising from the singular process of ontogenesis, for instance, the undulations of wood or kind of fingerprint type rings of the wood. I will just read the quote here that I've highlighted. If there were not a certain inherence of the hexaity of the atom to matter or even to form, there wouldn't be the possibility of finding a principle of individuation in these invoked realities. So here he's criticizing Leibniz. He's saying that you can't explain if individuality hinges on this idea of hexaity as singularity, then you can't explain the singularity of complex beings simply by positing that there is an atom which itself is the first ingredient of hexaity. You would have to explain where does the atom get its hexaity or its singularity from. Okay, so where are we? Paragraph 3. Let me just see where we are. This is a long one here. Hylomorphism. I think we looked at that. Is this big enough for you to read? I can't make it bigger. Is the little note that I put in the bottom, is that big enough to read for you?
It's quite hard to read.
Okay, let me try and make this bigger if I can. Is it readable now?
For me, it was also before, but this is also good.
This is the biggest I can make it. I'll read this for you then. In the context of a discussion of individuation, form and matter, which are the topics of the first chapter of Simondon's thesis, the term sunolon refers to Aristotle's metaphysics. That this is a concept he introduced here just above. Although the word is also used in Plato, it does not have the same meaning, and it is not developed as systematically as it was in Plato. In the available literature, both the transliterated form of synolon and sunolon are commonly used. The word sunolon is given the most attention in the book 7 of Aristotle's Metaphysics, Zeta, where it appears in various declensions. The sunolon, sorry, I can't read these because I can't read Greek. And at the end of the post are listed excerpts. So I'll give you this. I hope you can see the website that I've taken this from here. where basically substance is the indwelling of form, of which and of the matter so-called, of which, oh God, I didn't realize that pasting this, it scrambled itself up. So substance, it doesn't, so I think it's a translation that doesn't really make much sense. But basically this is form and matter. So just trying to make sense of this again. I took this from a website called aphelis.net, which is run by someone called Philippe Theophanidis, and I found it very useful when I came across it, but now I'm a bit confused by what I posted here. So substance is the indwelling, I suppose, of form in matter, I guess, of which and of the matter so-called concrete substance is composed. Yeah, I think I scrambled up this. Car la substance et la forme immanente dans l'union avec la matière constitue ce qu'on appelle la substance composée. So the term sunolon that you would have come across in the introduction is the indwelling of form in matter, is the kind of composite of form and matter. Substance equals composite, equals form and matter. You could put it this way, I think, without distorting it too much. So which paragraph over here? Man, this is a long paragraph. You can tell that Simondon himself was anxious writing this. Operation versus principle. Now, what is a complete being? Paragraph 2. So more than one. I think this is the paragraph 3. Here he talks about the hidden operation of individuation, or what hasn't been considered in classical accounts of individuation, namely the operation itself of individuation, its role in individuation. And Simondon shows how classical accounts obscure this operation of individuation, which he wants to turn into the protagonist, if you like, of his own theory of individuation. So here what you have is the critique of both a kind of a philosophy putting substance at its core, and on the other hand, a philosophy that is hylomorphic, that thinks about substance as the meeting of form and matter, which obscure the thing that makes matter and form encounter, which is the operation of individuation. So Simondon wants to center the operation itself, put that at the center of the process of individuation, and not just what results from it, which would be a kind of partial result of individuation, which is the individuated being. And the being kind of ignores both the operation and the system that co-emerges and co-evolves with the process of individuation. So hexeity then here is this thisness or uniqueness of the individual, which for Simondon is not a principle, but that which emerges through the operation of individuation. So this is Simondon trying to recenter process over outcome, genesis over structure. And the question you might ask yourself is, why would metaphysics have overlooked the operation of the individual? Why focus only on the outcome of individuation and not on the kind of genesis proper? So here you can see in my notes on the side, scrap the Aristotelian idea of substance as defined by essences and specificities. This is, I think, quite a massive intervention in terms of a contemporary philosophical gesture in rolling back the entire history of philosophy. Scrap also the pre-existing recipe or logic or essence or cause or principle of individuation. There is nothing you can reduce individuation to that would pre-exist individuation itself. So this is another, I think, quite massive intervention with important ethical consequences. you can only understand individuation if you look at the operation of individuation and at the singularities and the kind of problematic field that this operation resolves. And the outcome of it isn't predestined, and you cannot reduce individuation to anything that pre-exists individuation itself. There's a non-reductive approach, which think of this as in 1958, a kind of philosophical discourse being written in a moment when really molecular biology takes off and you begin to think that all of life could be reduced to certain principles. And I suppose it's the period also when the first discoveries are made in DNA and the theory of DNA and so forth. Morgan, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you partially answered my question. I think just by hearing you talking, I was kind of thinking, how come such a text comes so late in like the formulation of that question? Because it seems like a quite in-depth, let's say, deconstruction of that concept. But that sounds to me like a quite, now that I read it, of course, a quite logical problem, right? It's kind of like asking about the chicken or the egg or something like this. And the fact that this is rendered as so inherently complex to solve, but that it's a text that comes from the 20th century, makes me wonder if there, because you kind of contextualize within the frame of molecular biology as like perhaps a new understanding of this kind of things, but is it just the formulation of the question that's new, or were there truly not this kind of question pre-formulated before?
I mean, it's new in a way that is interesting, because Simondon is very much a contemporary of the emergent cybernetic discourse, which looks at operations which looks at system-wide transformations rather than just individual. The kind of, if you think that most of classical philosophy was concerned with a kind of inventory, making the inventory of the stuff that the world is made of, classifying into genera and species and types of things, kind of ordering everything, the big book of life, if you like. And so this emergence of cybernetic theory is one that looks at systems behavior. It comes to a certain extent from control theory in engineering. So the idea, for instance, that when you move a tiller on a big ship, the feedback mechanism of the water swerving around the tiller, if you do it too fast, you can break the tiller, basically. That you have feedback mechanisms that need to be incorporated into the understanding of the dynamical unfolding of a system. So cybernetics start to look at systems-wide behaviors, at processes of feedback and recursivity. So Simondon is part of this moment of thought, but there's also something missing from cybernetics. So I think it's a springboard for him, and he's not stopping there. And we'll see where he takes it, if you like. So he doesn't kind of pluck it out of the air completely. He also, another springboard for it, I mean, to a certain extent, you have a system, the big attempts at system philosophy in the 19th century with Hegel and Schelling, and slightly differently with Fichte as well. At Simondon, one of the approaches that Simondon takes a breath, it says, yes, fine, you have a systems philosophy in Hegel, but he tries to understand the dynamic evolution of the system according to a pre-existing logic, be it the logic of the dialectics, for instance. And Simondon says there's no pre-existing logic. The logic needs to be understood as something that is the consequence of the singularities of a kind of problematic field that is resolved through the process of individuation, in the process of which a system is established, and at the same time, as a byproduct of it, the emergence of a structure that can be an individual of any kind, an atom, or a society, a kind of collective body, or an organism, or whatever entity it is that you're looking at, is a byproduct of this systemic transformation. Sebastian.
So in that line of thought, the individual is then not a single isolated thing that exists, but rather comes to be through the contingencies of the interactions with other objects, right?
That's the main point, exactly.
Um,
The main point is the retrospective illusion of substantialist accounts of the individual was to end up thinking of the individual. And when I say individual, obviously I'm not talking about the human individual, but that too. If you think of individualism as a philosophical lineage and history, that too emerges from this retrospective illusion that starting from the individual, trying to understand the cause of the individual makes you blind to a kind of systemic approach that would look at the individual as something whose individuation cannot be understood if it is kind of plucked from the system that evolves in such a way that an individual emerges. If I say things in too confusing ways, you all can also say, sorry, that doesn't make sense. But Clara.
Oh,
did
hello, nice to meet you.
Hello, Clara. Did I just skip someone? Was there someone
I
else? who
think
had
we are
hand?
two Claras, that's why.
Oh, yes.
Go ahead, you
I'm
had
so
your hand.
sorry.
Okay, anyway, go ahead, Clara, and hello.
All right, thank you. This is very interesting. I think I appreciate you kind of crossing out the before the being, because I think the way I read this definitely was thinking about individuals. And to like Morgan's point, I couldn't help but kind of consider this in the context of the rise of like social and cultural psychology. You know, like generally speaking, Freud kind of focused on the individual, this concept of like there must be a reason intrinsic to your past that is embedded and coded in your own psyche, and then your being is explained by looking at and kind of like excavating your own past. But then with the rise of more structured form of system thinking and like thinking larger scale, we kind of come from as a product of the system of like I think this systems philosophy kind of interestingly coincides with the rise of a more system-based approach to studying psychology. And I just wanted to bring this up as a point because I think this was, I don't know, to me this was a kind of a helpful way to think of how I mean, again, this is I kind of interpret it as the being, not being experiencing, but it was a way for me to kind of and understand that something can come out. In fact, like things can be explained through the process of becoming, of being embedded in a system that you're both a product, but you're actively, to quote the actual, I think this was interesting. The living being is an agent and a theater of individualism. I think you're both the site and the thing. And I think that recursive thinking to me was helpful to understand in that way.
Is that your background, psychology, or?
I had a double major in in like psychology, specifically moral psychology, and developmentalism, and then art history. Now I'm more then I got a master's in art history and I work in the art world. But yeah, I kind of this to me sparked my now 8 years old like psychology education.
Yeah, amazing. And it should too, because I read a fantastic thesis by Francesca Sunseri, which isn't translated yet. And I don't know if I can ask her. In fact, I would like to invite her in the future to do a seminar too, where she showed something I wasn't aware the extent to which Simondon's thinking comes out of an kind of serious study of experimental psychology.
Mm-hmm.
The becoming scientific of psychology in France, the working in labs, rather than a kind of abstract philosophical existentialist psychology. That transition very much informed Simondon's thinking. That is also after this thesis that he submitted, he then taught psychology, which when I was a student was often presented like a kind of demotion, like, oh, he was, people didn't know what to do with this philosophy of technology, and they kind of exiled him into psychology as you would exile someone to Siberia. No, that's not true. He's really worked on psychology, and experimental psychology is very much at the molten core of this philosophy, which isn't itself reducible to psychology because psychology itself isn't reducible to mere thought processes. So there's a kind of systems approach here. So this is really, really very well spotted. And yeah, we'll get Francesca to come and talk about this more in the future. If she makes it available, I'm sure with automatic translation, you can go a long way. Also, thanks for pointing out this crossing out. I don't mean to say, I didn't mean to do this as a correction of something that's wrong. The text itself allows for both readings. Lettre, in the context where Simondon writes, and he has these kind of rhapsodic sentences where honestly sometimes it swirls in ways that the kind of logical progression of it isn't linear or totally clear. You could totally legitimately think that he's talking about the being as in terms of the individual. And I don't think that makes sense. I think that makes more sense if you fold this level of narrative all like a loop. I don't know if you've ever done stitching. My grandmother once taught me like you go one step forward and then half a step back. And it feels to me like he always loops back, everything back into the fundamental stakes of a speculative metaphysics of becoming. And so this is about, in speculative terms, beings, the being with a capital B, the becoming of being, and then in more empirical senses, the becoming, the emergence and evolution of systems, part of which is the emergence of structures that have individuality or hexaity. And the singularity of this hexaity is indissociable, is precisely not an individual that stands alone, but it is indissociable from the tension that is resolved in a system by the emergence of a structure that has individuality. So, other Clara, please.
Maybe just a small note also about the crossing of the word or the article D, because it kind of interested me. Also, like I have a background in artistic research, so not philosophy. Also, this is very new to me. But I would be interested maybe like what would be like the crossing of the word in like Derridian sense, you know? It might also create like some other readings and other like create other concepts. And also other note, I was thinking about, you mentioned also like this being and system, and both being and system are transforming itself. So also these like the article D may also be a way to transform, or there is a difference in between when you put D in front of the word. So then it kind of changes the meaning. So there is a certain transformation happening.
No, there is, and bearing in mind that this is an issue that arises specifically with translation, where the presence or absence of the makes a difference. If you talk about being, we know that we're talking about being in general. If you talk about the being, you imply that you're talking about the individual. Whereas in French, lettre can be both, but certainly as an intervention, if you like, on the text that I did in order for it to make sense of it for myself, my own traversal through the text, which I'm kind of taking you all along, but it isn't dictatorial in the sense that people can still roll it back and say, no, we're talking about the individual being here. Then you have to kind of do your own job of reinterpreting this section. But yeah, I think it's kind of a good idea for us in this seminar to keep it visible. Amin.
Yeah, I just wanted to per se maybe anticipate this dialogue. So all in all, especially when you brought up the French translation, understanding through translation, and the this ontogenesis, so through Derridian dialogics, I think that does draw a lot of parallels to hauntology and how in French we, on cache le H, so we do not pronounce the H. So essentially, I think I'm asking what are the inherent limitations of this epistemological approach purely through translation. A good example would be in French, the savoir, se connaître, which may connotate and denote this whole myriology of Gestalt psychology, as Renzo mentioned, and the metaxis of how being constructs itself through the very function of becoming, and driving forwards and atomic logics, and the contributions through quantum theory. So I think that the inherent limitations here would be maybe through Gödel's incompleteness theorem, if we are to approach this topic as such.
Yeah, I think this is a nice way of thinking of it, and I have a little bit further down towards the end of the text. I hope we can kind of speak. Oh gosh, it's already 4:30 we start. Okay, we still have an hour, but I want to keep more time also to talk about maybe to do introductions later. But there is, towards the end of the text, I think that Simondon gestures towards French epistemology, towards a kind of conversation that was happening around axiomatic set theory and the pluralization of logics, and what came after the crisis of foundation of mathematics in the early 20th century. It's not explicitly in the text, but we'll get to this in a bit. But I think the fact that you cannot preempt individuation with a given logic makes me think that being with a capital B and not yet individuated or pre-individual being, I thought maybe you could define it as a set that does not contain itself, as a set, if you like, whose that cannot be predefined by rules that would contain it, if you like. I don't know. I need your help also to think through this later. But yeah, let's come back to this in a bit. And if I'm not going too fast, I'll probably try and quicken the pace a little bit so that we have some satisfaction getting nearer the end of the text. I think it's okay if we don't talk about the prospectus today, because that's literally just the blurb on the end of the book. And it was just to not forget that we're reading the introduction so that we later situate the thought about the individuation of technical objects, if you like, the individuation also. What is the cascading? What is the Russian doll system within which technical objects and their lineages and ensembles individuate? Anyway, let's move on from this. Maybe why did I lose the bit with the I just want to read you this bit here so that we see how it makes sense when you read it without the article in English. And this is about being with a capital B, I think, in a speculative sense, being in general as something that is more than one, but also the being or the individual being as not being an absolute separate autonomous entity, but rather something that is more than one, whose identity is not resolved in its own kind of autonomous existence, but needs to be understood dynamically as the system with which it kind of co-emerges and co-evolves. So let's read this. You can all see which bit I've just highlighted, right? Okay. The word ontogenesis takes on its full meaning. Instead of granting it the restricted and derived sense of the individual's genesis, in opposition to a vaster genesis, for example, that of the species. So what he's referring to here, he's talking about the 19th century biologist Haeckel, who thought of ontogenesis or ontogeny as the account of, for instance, embryogenesis, of the kind of stages through which an individual goes from conception to maturity. And his hypothesis was that this ontogeny or ontogenesis was a recapitulation of the history of the species. So the kind of evolutionary history of the species happened in fast forward in the ontogeny or ontogenesis of the individual organism. And Simondon says there is another way of thinking about ontogenesis that isn't reduced to thinking only about the kind of history of inception or conception to maturity of the individual, but a larger sense of ontogenesis. So again, the word ontogenesis takes on its full meaning, beyond Haeckel, beyond granting it the restricted and derived sense of only the individual's genesis. I'm sprinkling this a little bit with extra words here. Rather a vaster genesis, vaster also than the genesis of the species. A veritable ontogenesis then is made to designate the nature of beings becoming. The nature of beings becoming. I think you could probably say the beings becoming. What is in the nature of becoming such that an individual individuates? Namely, so a veritable ontogenesis is that through which being in general, or the being that is individual, becomes, insofar as it is, qua being. So here you might recall that earlier at the beginning of the text, he says individuation is about being qua individual, so being qua singular thisness. And here he talks about being qua being, which makes me think but then let's keep those two options rolling side by side. He says, it is possible that the opposition of being and becoming may be valid only within a certain doctrine that supposes the very model of being is substance. So opposing being and becoming like Parmenides did, for instance, he says being is eternal and becoming is a kind of side effect of our perception of it. That would be, I mean, I'm projecting this here onto the text, yeah. That would be an error induced by a philosophy that is based on the notion of substance. So substance, again, is this sunolon, is a meeting of form and matter that results in a substance that has an essence, an identity, and a definition. Simondon moves away from this. But it is also possible to suppose that becoming is a dimension of being, so that being essentially is something that is in becoming, and also the being, or whatever individual we look at, is essentially something that is involved in a process of becoming, and that it corresponds to being's capacity to phase shift with respect to itself. So being in the general sense, and also the individual being has a capacity to phase shift insofar as the individual is considered not as individual but as system. Within the individual itself, it becomes a theater of individuations. It becomes like pre-individual, a place where further individuations can take place. Okay, so you have this kind of Russian doll effect, that every individual that exists is itself a system within which there is room for further individuations. Here is another kind of red herring of translation, which may well have been my fault or induced by me, although perhaps I got it from secondary literature at the time. And none of the many people involved in the translation really picked up on this. This is something that the engineer and philosopher Yamor Denizan pointed out to me. A phase shift, I presume, is something that actually I need to get the Kemal, do you think you can help me with this if you're still on here? I mean, I always assumed that phase shift was the term that designates a phase transition. For instance, if water starts boiling, you have a kind of homogeneous substance, and then the form, kind of hexagonal cells of ebullition emerge from this. Or that if you reach the point of freezing, the form of crystals emerges as a kind of phase transition. But apparently the term phase shift talks more about the phases of frequencies, which would kind of separate out. Looking backwards, I'm now not completely sure if perhaps that's what Simondon meant, or that it. But yeah, this is something I would need a kind of scientific.
Yeah, in the text, you mean, right? The being's capacity to phase shift with respect to itself, right? So
Yeah.
I think it's really kind of a phase transition, my understanding as well. It's like from one phase, like one say, critical point to another critical point, and then I think this critical point in the sense that we can understand, I guess, as also kind of singularity, from one singularity to another, like kind of a discrete transformation rather than a continuous transformation, kind of.
Yeah, so the correct term would be phase transition, if at all, or Jagmore suggested the emergence of a phase where there was none, rather than a phase shift, which talks specifically, I think, about frequencies and how they kind of, I don't know what they do, but you can define it better than me. But
I see, yes. Yeah, I understand. So frequency, you mean like more like a continuous transformation, right? So, but here it sounds to me more like it's also kind of like a discrete transformation, in the sense that I think it's really like what type of a transformation that takes place in the physical sense, I mean.
Okay.
And phase shift, I think phase shift can also be used interchangeably with phase transition as well. But maybe phase transition sounds also more natural to me, actually.
Okay, I'll try and I'll get lost if I look in my documents now, but I have also our colleague Shinwei, I think he seemed to also think that phase shift was a kind of corresponded to a mathematical definition of something to do with frequencies, rather than this kind of physical phenomenon of the emergence of a phase, like the crystals from water or like the point of ebullition. Just to kind of point that out here. Sebastian and then Karis.
So coming from my own perspective, if you talk about phase shifts, you're discussing interference. Particularly, you're talking about two different waves where they encounter themselves and then they interfere.
Yeah.
But they can distract or create like a larger wave. Whereas when you talk about phase transition, you're talking about discrete transformation of the nature of the system, right? So there's the idea of an order parameter that changes through different configurations of the states of a particular system. So I wonder, like, I was trying to see which one would fit onto this phrase and both give it like expansive meanings. So I wonder exactly which one do you want to talk about, like the idea of interference between two collective phenomena that create something new, or the idea that you have a system that you're looking at and the external environment is kind of setting its configuration, right? In a macroscopical sense.
I would suggest, given the examples that Simondon gives, at least in this part of the text, that we stick to the idea of a phase transition or of the emergence of a phase where there was none, and that we don't drop entirely the notion of a phase shift in terms of the interference, which could still prove productive when you think about a system resolving its tensions, for instance. But I think it's more far-fetched. I would think that his prime example is that of crystallization, and that would be a phase transition or the emergence of a phase. The French word for it is déphasage, I think. So yeah, Karis and then Amin, and then just bear in mind that we have only, what is it, 3, 4, 5, yeah, and we have an hour left, right? So probably we're good.
Just to finish my comment.
Sorry about that, Sebastian.
No worries. But a phase transition is related to critical phenomena where there's like a sudden transformation, whereas a phase shift, you can see it as a continuous transformation, as Kamal mentioned before. So it's also something that is probably valuable to keep in mind.
I would love if you wanted to write an essay about this, because I think that in no small measure by my own ignorance about this and using the term phase transition in the translation of the mode of existence, which predated the translation of the individuation book, it would be really very nice to delve into the potentialities of these two translations, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think we can probably pull the register according to what is most relevant in a given example or in a given moment of the text. But for this notion of déphasage, Go ahead.
Just
Thank
say one
you. Sorry, just to say thank you, Sebastian. This was really very helpful. Kemal.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Just to yeah. Sebastian actually made it a good point with that. So with the phase shift, I think he really means here the kind of, let's say, if you have a kind of a wave, let's say like a sinusoidal wave, phase shift really means that you're really shifting the wave while preserving the nature of it. Kind of, it's kind of a continuous transformation in the sense that you don't really change it fundamentally. Like you just wait to look at like a translation of your system. You can think of it, but I think he really means the phase transition in the sense that he really make this. I mean, this transition as in a discrete manner. Like he really changes the kind of the interior structure of the system, kind of.
If I may just ask, and Sebastian mentioned that the phase shifts can be associated with sudden transformations of a system, which that would chime very much with the idea of metastability. So not to scare anyone with a word that we haven't come to yet, we'll come to that in a little bit. But if metastability is this utmost, Jagmore defined it as an utmost fragility of a system, that the slightest change of parameters can provoke a sudden radical transformation of how the system behaves. Perhaps, I don't know, that's kind of wondering whether what you meant, Sebastian, with a sudden transformation of a system, if there are processes related to phase shifts rather than phase transitions that can be thought in relation to that.
Do you want me to expand? I can talk about
Yeah,
it.
why not? Come on, this is important. This is close reading after all.
Okay, yeah. So maybe let's go back a bit and try to understand the two concepts and their context. The context, phase shift and phase transition, and they're used, at least in physics, in two different areas where phase shifts is related to the study of the relation between waves, right? So how one wave overlaps the other and how the relative positions of the waves generate a new one. So for example, I don't know if you all have had the experience of listening to music while moving through your room and then hearing how sound changes or the perception of sound changes as you change your position with respect to the speakers, right? And that happens because of phase shift, because the wave that's coming from your left speaker has to travel a longer distance than the wave that's coming from your right speaker. So you're able to hear this subtle difference between the sounds. That is phase shift, so the overlapping of two waves. And that overlap, or that sum of waves, creates a new wave. At some point, it can completely interfere destructively and annihilate both waves, right? So that's, let's say that's the background for the concept of phase shift, whereas phase transition appears as a concept when you're discussing the ordering of the internal constituents of a system. So for example, let's say we have a magnetic object. It is constituted deep inside by small magnetic vectors or arrows that it might be atoms or little molecules that are being ordered, right? So depending on the conditions that surround the material, these little magnetic arrows can point all of them on the same direction or to random directions. So a phase transition happens when conditions are right, and then suddenly all the arrows start pointing on the same direction, creating a magnetic material, for example.
Yeah. That's very helpful.
Exactly. And that transition happens, it's called a critical phenomena because it only happens when you cross certain threshold of the parameters of the system. So for example, with water, you have a threefold transition where there's a critical point where you can go from liquid to solid to a gas, right? And in that particular point, that metastable point, any perturbation of the system will take you to any of those particular configurations, right? So the system is not stable. It's kind of trying to look for the minimum of energy and to know where to go to or how to settle itself into some, a particular constitution, be it liquid, solid, or gas.
I think that's super helpful. And I might just say, to anticipate the kind of end point of this seminar, where some of you, depending on how you signed up for this, will write essays. If you were up for, if you, Sebastian, or someone else, or Kemal as well, were up for writing something, you might even write something together. I think it would be very worthwhile pushing this towards a small publication that would make a really helpful contribution to rectify, if you like, the necessary translation glitches that probably I don't know if I introduced it or if it's that I became familiar with this notion through English commentary already. But I think that's a really helpful way of not just as a misunderstanding, but how differently productive both concepts can be in the Simondonian concept, in the context, I mean. Anyway, so we close the parenthesis here so that we can move on. And just Amin, moving on to you quickly, and then we'll continue reading.
Yeah, I just wanted to add in, adding on Sebastian's and Kemal's points of view. I do not have much of an understanding for, through sinusoidal waves for the metacriticality. However, I think that it's very crucial to note that it's about information communication. So when systems achieve a state of super or metacriticality, that is optimal information transmission, which has to do with self-organization. So, however, as far as my own research goes, I don't think that in the context of embodiment or human cognition, that does translate very well. So yeah, food for thought. Just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, this is very, very interesting because we'll come to that too. And I think this is why also in a Simondonian sense, the tensions that arise from the possible options you have when you translate a text, I think should be treated as productive, except of course when they're outright wrong and unproductive, in which case, it's our job to retrospectively correct it. But we'll get to the concept of information, hopefully, now in a little bit. So let me just see, I'll just start again this sentence so we kind of wrap this. The word ontogenesis takes on a full meaning, understanding greater than ontogeny or greater than the mere kind of coming about of the and maturing of the organism. The word ontogenesis takes on its full meaning. And you know what I'm going to do? I'll slightly rephrase it as I read it because you have it in front of you, but you'll see then how I'm understanding this, which is not the last stop, but one step along the interpretation. The word ontogenesis takes on its full and veritable meaning, rather than that of the restricted and derived sense of the individual's genesis, when it is made to designate the nature of being's becoming, or the essence of what it means to become for an individual, namely that through which being with a capital B, or the being as an individual, becomes insofar as it is being. So not its becoming qua individual, but its becoming qua being. Understand in brackets something that includes pre-individual being. The becoming of being qua being, which includes pre-individual being. It is possible that the opposition of being and becoming may be valid only within a certain doctrine, understand classical philosophy, that supposes that the very model of being is substance. Think here Parmenides, Plato, and differently Aristotle. But it is also possible to suppose, so substance, remember substance, sunolon, is the encounter of matter and form, is something that would have an essence and an identity. So rather than taking this as a starting point, it is possible to suppose that becoming, the becoming of being, is itself the dimension of being. So it is, being has a dimension because it is in the process of becoming. Its dimensionality becomes pluridimensional the more processes of individuation or the more becoming happens in it. It kind of generates dimensions. So it is possible to suppose that becoming is a dimension of being and also a dimension of the individual being, and that it corresponds to being's capacity to phase transition with respect to itself, the déphasage, to kind of split into, let's not anticipate too much. So it is possible to suppose that becoming is a dimension of being in general and a dimension also of whatever individual being we're looking at, and that this becoming corresponds to the capacity of being to phase shift, to experience a phase transition with respect to itself, to go through a phase transition, both being in a speculative sense and the individual being is capable of, you can look at it as something that is capable of undergoing a phase transition, meaning a transition where it resolves itself by transitioning, phase transitioning. Pre-individual being is being in which no phase exists yet. Being in which an individuation is completed is that in which a resolution appears through the division of being into phases. So let's read this again so that we don't get lost here. Pre-individual being is being in which no phase exists yet. Now, if we were to say the individual being contains pre-individual being, this is when you look at the individual as a theater of individuation, because within me as an individual, there is still an indeterminacy, there is still something that is pre-individual, that is not yet individuated, that allows me to become to continue becoming through the emergence of new dimensions. So the pre-individual in me means that I can be the theater of individuations in a way that is analogous to the big speculative sense of being as a kind of, pre-individual being, speculatively conceived as something in which no phase exists yet. So the being in which in which an individuation is completed, think here either the individual as theater of individuations, the individual conceived at from the angle of individual as a system within which individuations can happen, or being in a kind of critique of Parmenides as something that is capable of giving rise to a division within the pre-individual, the emergence of phases where there were none, and the emergence of these phases corresponds to new dimensions of being, i.e. becoming. The becoming of being is this emergence of new dimensions. Think then of becoming not as a framework in which being exists, or in which the individual being exists, but rather as becoming is the dimension of being, the dimensionality, the potential dimensionality, the mode of resolution of an incompatibility that is rich in potential. So this is important to understand. The only reason why there is the potential for the emergence of new dimensions is that the pre-individual isn't a passive blob, isn't matter sitting there waiting for form to inseminate it, but rather is something that is riven with potentialities, riven with tensions, that is ready to kind of transform itself also suddenly, and give rise to these critical phase transitions through which a new phase of being emerges in what was previously phaseless or pre-individual. So individuation can be defined as the appearance of phases in being that are phases of being. So if, just slowing down here, if the emergence of a phase in pre-individual being is the individual, the phase that emerges, let's say the crystal that emerges from a freezing water. Let's say you have a kind of pre-individual, consider a pool of water as pre-individual, as a system within which, as yet, on our level of analysis, of course, there are atoms and so forth, but on the level that we're looking at, this is pre-individual, and the crystal emerges as a phase, so the phase transition, and the individual is, the crystal is the individual that we're looking at. Then the crystal or the individual is a phase of being in a more general sense. This is why you can't look at the individual as a self-sufficient, autonomous substance and essence, because I, as an individual, the same as a crystal forming in a lake, we are phases of being in general. Does that make sense? Did I complicate this unnecessarily, or Lynn, go ahead.
Yeah, I still don't really understand the limitations of the word phase or the concept of phase. So what defines a phase exactly, or how can we distinguish one from another? So sort of who is the one who is defining, or what are the principles of the phases formation?
Okay, so there's two questions, I think, in your question. One was that we had a rather technical discussion about the translation of the French word déphasage, which on the one hand, one could translate as phase shift, but actually in English, phase shift refers to something that is different from a phase transition. So don't worry about that too much. Just think more in very simple terms. The phase transition is something that happens in physical and chemical terms when you have a sudden and critical transformation of a system. Think of water crystallizing. So the structure of the water suddenly changes quite drastically. So part of the water is perhaps still liquid and pre-individual on that level, and part of the water is already crystallizing, and the crystal here could be the phase that emerges, but the crystal is also what becomes individual within what was previously pre-individual. Does that make sense?
I think my question was not about the phase shifting or transition shifting, which I understood, but rather further when it says, in the being that are the phases of the being. So where the word phase is used in the text, and I think also a little bit.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah.
Phases in the being. This is not very easy. So individuation corresponds to the appearance of phases in being. And the being is a phase in being. This is not a straightforward of saying it, a straightforward way. So let me work through this. Individuation corresponds to the appearance of a phase. So think liquid water, the appearance of the crystal, which is a phase in being, understood here as the pre-individual being of the water. And the appearance of a phase that is a phase of being. So I think this is the critical aspect here. Is a phase in being, but it is also a phase of being. So just as I am an individual in the world, if you like, I am an individual of the world. This is not a completely correct analogy, because the world, of course, is already highly structured and individuated. But to say in a silly way, the crystal is a phase in water, but it is also a phase of water. It's not something separate from water. I mean, it separates itself out through this phase transition, but it is of the water. It's still a process that belongs to the water. Does that answer the question?
Partially. I think it answers the question about this sentence, but I'm still not quite sure if we go away from the example of water, because I think the text is rather general, right? So we can try to apply it to various situations. And I'm just wondering, what are the limitations of a phase? So how do we know that this phase is shifting to another one if we talk about more abstract procedures, like not necessarily water?
Okay, the way you know it, so you have to think in the beginning of the text, we start, let's say, with the individual, let's say the crystal. And you say, how did the crystal come about? But looking at it this way, you look at the crystal not as a crystal, you look at the crystal as something in, let's say, a container, but not of it. So by putting the principle of individuation first, how do you know that there is a phase? You know it because you're looking at something that has an individual structure. So whatever it is that you consider that is the object of your study in physics, in chemistry, in biology, the organism, for instance, whatever it is that you look at as an individual needs to be understood as a phase that is not only in being, a phase that emerges in being, a kind of critical emergence of structure that is not only in being, but that is of being. So it is being in a kind of speculative, large sense that individuates through us. We are a swirl or a phase of being, and we are in being too. Does that answer the question?
Yes, so just to clarify once more, I'm sorry if I'm taking too much.
Not at all. I'm sure everybody else is really benefiting from this, because honestly, this is a very obscure way of putting it here in Simondon's text.
So you would say that depending on the discipline and the point of view, we could consider various things as a phase in.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
So it just depends on the perspective of what we consider individual. So for example, if I am coming from composition, atoms for me wouldn't be relevant in this regard, so they wouldn't be part of the phase in this kind of perspective.
Exactly. Really interesting to think a melody, for instance, as a process of individuation. What is the identity of a melody? What is the melody in, and what is it of, if you like, in terms of a process of individuation that involves not only the emergence of the phase that is the melody, but the transformation of a system within which such a thing as individuation of a melody can arise. So if you like to put it, to reverse the phrasing of Simondon, individuation happens not only in being, but to being. This is the critical thing to understand about Simondon. That's why individuation is never only the individuation of the individual. It is the individuation of being in a speculative sense. It is the individuation of a system in a more narrow empirical sense. And a kind of side product of individuation of a system is the individual. That's, I think, the critical thing that your question helps to zero in. And this is why it's so important to kind of, not continue asking if it's still not clear, because I think it's really helpful for everybody else too, is to think that the individual, whatever individual it is that is the object of your study, has to be understood as happening in being, say either being in speculative sense, or a system in empirical sense, but it is of the system too. It's not kind of ontologically completely separate. It's a kind of co-evolution of system and individual. That's the unit that individuates, and not just the individual. I think that's kind of helpful. Okay, Karis, and then Peggy, and I don't know one hand, and then Renzo.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I was also in the same kind of question on this particular part of the text, and I think it's connecting the phases with the part where it says to be in respect of itself and ontogenesis, may I suggest that the individuation or like dividing some things from other things, for example, the thunder from the cloud and the rain, and how we understand them and coming to an ontogenesis of them also resonates with our functionality as beings and how we articulate them and constantly informing our becoming, because I think that what he is trying to say is that the individuation is related to our own becoming, the point that we manage to go in our context. For example, I would also ask the question of, can you be an individual in the Simondonian context without understanding the process of individuation? But each one of us will understand it in a different way, which is connected to the language we have access to already at this point. So what I'm trying to say is that the individuation and the phases of the being, understanding a phase of being, means that I'm here now and I understand that I had a different understanding in a previous phase, a different system of ontogenesis, so as until now. And from that point on, that I understand this ontogenesis differently, I have more or different access to my potentiality.
Yeah, it's a deep question that you posed. I think we should come back to it, and maybe it would be really nice if you could write it down and think of it as a potential essay question, because it leads quite far.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it's definitely a very interesting and worthwhile hypothesis, because it links to what comes at the end of the introduction, where Simondon says we cannot know things other than to individuate ourselves in a mode that is analogous somehow to whatever individual and whatever process of individuation we're trying to think and understand. So your individuation, I think this is how I'm understanding what you're saying, is that you're grasping and getting to know the individuation, including the individuation of Simondon's thought, happens through the individuation of your own thought. And your own thought it happens to you, but it is also of you.
Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, okay, great, lovely, thank you. I think it's Renzo and Peggy, or the other way around, I can't remember. And then after that, I think we need 5-minute pee break. I had so much coffee earlier, and you probably, I don't know, if like me.
Cécile, hi. We can leave after the coffee if you want.
No. After you and Peggy.
Okay. I was thinking in the previous question related to the phases and the pre-individual, on my own understanding. As I understand, the pre-individual only have the operation through the information, because we know Simondon was very in the cybernetic aspect, how information inform the matter, no, as an energy, information as an energy, as a metastable energy. So in that sense, I was thinking the pre-individual doesn't have phase because it's awaiting for the triggering of the information for constitute in any phase in this continuous metastability.
Yes.
No? So when you mention the example of the water or the crystals, I suppose you're doing in one phase of individuation that is the concretization of that in the physical individuation, right? When it's concretizing and it's not possible go more far away in this metastability because it's concrete, the crystals are concrete. There is no more development no more genesis in the crystals. When water becomes crystals.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think in that case, and this is really interesting because we'll come throughout, both here in the introduction when we come to it, and in Simondon's book on the mode of existence of technical objects. Concretization is a slightly technical term that has more to do with abstraction, with something becoming less abstract and more concrete in the sense. Yeah, we'll get to it because I think we're jumping ahead of ourselves slightly, but these are all the relevant categories towards which this text is moving, because ultimately, in the strangest way possible, this is a very elaborate commentary on cybernetics and information theory. His intervention really is, I think, happens at the crossroads of cybernetics and experimental psychology. So we're moving towards this, but from the widest possible angle. So maybe, we'll come back to this when we start to get a firmer grip on some of the technical notions involved in information and concreteness or concretization being one of them. But yeah, that's good question. Peggy, and hello, Peggy.
Hi, I may have lost it by now, but I was going to say, I think the real thing to consider is that we are all limited, whether we're whatever domain of existence we're talking about, by the substance that we are. You know, we cannot really break our form or matter. We can, our individuality, our individuation is that essence that he's talking about, and that potentiality that can be different from the pre-individual state and can be changed through the tension or the metastability or whatever it is that brings change around. But I'm a person. I'm going to go through the stages of being a person, you know. Information, I know, I think that the exteriority of data clouds and big data are jumping through the limitations of interiority out to exteriority, but that's later on to even talk about. But we're sort of limited, you know.
It's such an interesting, Peggy, this is such a good question, because this really throws the bridge towards, you know, from the introduction of the individuation book to the mode of existence of technical objects. And in a way, it vindicates the reason for reading the MEOT, the mode of existence of technical objects, backwards, because you could also argue that it is precisely the limitation of our own individuality as biological organisms that gives rise. We are also the theater of individuations. To the extent that we are not fully determined, we give rise to new phases, to kind of psychic development, to collective psychosocial or trans-individual development. We'll come back to this term later, and to the invention of technicities or technical schemas, elements, individuals, ensembles. I mean, the whole lineage of evolution of technical objects are also so many of the different phases that emerge out of the limitation of our biological individuation. And that brings me back to that sentence we just read, because, and if you like, to the first question we had about mysticism, because if you think that being is not only, that the individual is not only in being, but of being, so we are, I as an individual, as an organism, with all these added dimensions of, you know, my psychic and collectivity. I am not only in being and of being, but conversely, that means that being is not only the container within which I am, but the infinitude of being is.
You know, I studied with Badu when I was at EGS, and since you want to talk about, you know, I'm talking about mystical states because I'm not good at mathematics. When he gets into talking about set theory and the potentiality, and then he jumps over into infinitudes, you just really made me think about this when we were having this discussion. But, you know, I really thought that session was sort of a mystical state, you know, and I've never understood it again.
Someone wrote, what's his name again? Reinaldo Young is a Uruguayan composer who wrote a beautiful thesis combining a Simondonian and a Badusian ontology. This is really something you might want to look at, and his thesis is also available to read online, and we also published an article about it in French, which is a shorter version, and we worked on it a lot in terms of editing. So if you translated that would be a nice way into
For
his.
French, I don't think that's possible. How do you spell his? You could just put that in the chat later. I will go take a look at it.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, you should. Everyone actually is a really interesting text where he talks about the inconsistent multiple of Badiou, and he uses the concept of noise for a kind of Simondon inspired ontology.
Yeah, I can see that.
And he does that through what he calls a kind of pedagogy of noise. Really creative, really, really interesting. I'll put it in the chat so that, oh, I just realized, sorry, I didn't see all the lovely comments in the chat. I'll come back to that. But so I put the name here, Ronaldo Young.
And Cassandra, I think you can use Simondon for anything.
So you'll find that easily if you Google it. So I would say we'll have a little break now. 5 minutes, and then we have to already wrap up. So we'll, I think we made kind of not as much progress through the introduction as I would have wanted to. But on the other hand, I think that the questions were incredibly important so that we're not just kind of formalistically adding words and concepts together, but that we really get to grips with why we're reading this introduction, and the kind of mode of existence is going to slot into this quite not neatly for sure, but much more productively than if you just, you know, superficially set them side by side. So let's have a small break. We come back, then we talk about the structure of the seminar as a whole. And if you like, in the next session, we can come back to finish the introduction. And that just means that we have to compress everything else coming after that a little bit more. You can think about that. But yeah, I would say, can we come back at 16 past, quarter past, 16 past? Yeah? Good. See you in a sec. Thanks, Reda. I suggest we go through the chat so that we haven't missed any comments that perhaps we haven't dealt with yet. Not staying too long on these. If need be, we kind of jot them down and keep them for the next session. Next session, read the introduction again and the prospectus, and we read the second part of the introduction. And then when this really sits well, I think it's going to be, it's a lot anyway, even in 8 sessions to go through all the texts very well. But I think the way we're doing it now is quite productive. So hopefully we'll, even if we make it only through part of the mode of existence of technical objects, we'll make sure that we traverse the most important crossings, if you like. So let's look at the comments, and then I need at least 5 minutes to talk about presentations and about essays, and can't remember what else. I think that's it. I would have really loved to do introductions too. I think it would be really nice to do them in the next session. Then we'll do the second part of the introduction and leave some more space for, perhaps we should start with introductions actually, then we see. It's really important for me to know where people come from, what you bring to the table, if you like, in reading Simondon. I don't mean that as a kind of level as what philosophical knowledge you bring to treating the text, but rather in terms of our collective individuation, what are the various kind of confluences of you know, problems, creative processes in which reading Simondon can make sense and can lead to, you know, trans-individual relation. So let's look at the comments. I go back to the top. Renzo Simondon, always going to take a big part of our life, indeed, to understand, but it is part of his metastable ideas. Yeah, let's go. Simondon takes a lot of Gestalt psychology in his individuation idea. Yeah, Renzo, exactly. This is absolutely true. I think Gestalt psychology was very important to Simondon, and part of the next kind of moment in the introduction that we were going to get to is simply that you need to go beyond the idea of stability. So if Gestalt theory was right to look at perception as from a systems theoretical point of view, rather than at the Gestalt itself, it's interesting in French when you say, no, I think in Italian, if you say individuare is to perceive something as well. The problem with Gestalt theory was that it was about a form of stability that wasn't about becoming, was rather about being than becoming. So this becoming in terms of successive waves of emergences of new phases, that's what Simondon is after. So you need to take Gestalt theory and kind of tilt it and then make it roll and make it dynamical. So Joao, I just wanted to share something. I would normally ask you to read it, but it's going to take too long if everyone reads out their own comments, and we have so little time left. So I'll just read them out. I just wanted to share something I recently discovered. I'm currently researching Simondon and analogy, and Simondon provides in Il Fit a source for thinking analogies. Bruno de Solage, the priest. Yeah, I just read his Initiation to Metaphysics. You mean Bruno Solage? You read Bruno Solage? Very nice. So I just read his Initiation to Metaphysics, and the first part is all about the scientific discoveries Simondon discusses. But since it is a course, it is very didactical. Solage writes that the microscope and the telescope imploded the individual. That modern science sees in the simplest pebble a compounded being crossed by multiple strata that we now can conceive and study. This helped me understand the importance of studying the individual for Simondon. It would be interesting if you have a PDF, by the way, that can be shared without running into problems with copyright. That would be really awesome. So Renzo says, fortunately, we don't have this issue in the Spanish version. That'd be something else interesting to discuss. This, I presume you mean the article in front of being, the being and being. Is that what you meant, Renzo? Or... Anyway, Sebastian Mesa says phase transition. Yes, okay. Peggy, isn't a phase shirt also the terminal individual and I'm not sure. I think there's probably a typo, right?
Yep, there is a typo, and I probably forgot what it is at this time.
Welcome to
I
my
was
little...
thinking about the phase shifting when that wonderful story about the morph that's in its crystalline stage and it opens up and it changes its shape. That's an invention and imagination.
Yeah, I'm not. You were thinking about what?
There's an image in imagination and invention where there's a moth that is, in his little stage hanging down without, and he evolves and he opens up and he shifts his phase someplace.
A moth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, is that in the bit where he talks about evolution? No, about metamorphosis.
Yeah, it must be.
Okay,
But
yeah, that's a lovely.
It's a phase shifting, and it's just a beautiful little image about how
It's really nice if you find it again for next time. We
yeah,
can post it in the Discord. You all have the Discord, access to the Discord channel, right?
Mm-hmm.
If anyone doesn't, then let me know, because that's a place to kind of chuck in all your references and all your PDFs and everything else. So Renzo says, as I understand, it is relating to information aspects. So this is probably a conversation we had. Joao says, in Portuguese, this was translated as déphasement, which means the restoration of classical behavior in a system after a quantum situation. Okay, this is probably specific to a moment in the conversation that we were. Okay, the emergence of a phase fits the metaphor of the moth. To become out of phase, interesting as well. individuation happens in phases, says Renzo, and the pre-individual being is necessarily not individuated. Dephasing describes how pre-individual becomes individual, whilst still retaining within itself an overflow of pre-individual potentialities which can serve as the basis for future individuation. That's it. So déphasage in French, and in English I would say something like phase transition, presumably, or the emergence of a phase, or in specific circumstances we can still see if there's a room for thinking about phase shifts, but in brackets as a kind of special case. So may I provide an example from the systems perspective? That we missed that opportunity. Sebastian. Oh no, you did tell us this. Okay. Cassandra, if phase transitioning constitutes a sort of standing out from, a pre-individual context, what are the conditions of this standing out? Are we back in a conceptual mode here? That's a very interesting question. And I might, just before we leave, give you one little thing about Leibniz. So Leibniz uses the term hexeity to refer to the individualizing principle that distinguishes one individual from another. So this is a different approach to Simondon's, but it answers perhaps this question here. So Leibniz uses the term hexeity. This is a word that was invented by Duns Scotus to say this here, which would have been the only concept adequate to define the individual, because all other concepts talk about things that are true also of other things. So this can be only one concept that is true only of the individual, which would be the this here, the hexeity. So Leibniz uses this Scotus's term hexeity to refer to the individualizing principle that distinguishes one individual from another, even if they share the same qualitative processes. So the qualities in themselves are not enough to distinguish something according to its individuality. Two atoms can have the same qualities and still be separate individuals. It's the thisness or suchness of an individual that makes it unique. Leibniz believed that hexeity, along with a complete concept, helps to explain individuation and the identity of substances. And I think this is where the question of the concept arises. And later in the introduction, there's a bit where Simondon talks about concepts. It isn't intuitive unless you know that, I presume he's referring to the way that Leibniz defines hexeity as something. The hexeity comes with a complete concept, a concept that explains individuation as an identity of substance. And we know that Simondon is moving away from substances in the Aristotelian sense, as a sunolon, as a kind of, as the equation for a particular type of form matter that has its own definition and its own essence. So it's not the essence in that definition that comes first. For Simondon instead, it's this process of individuation, is the operation that resolves the tensions in a system, that informs it with its singularity. So the singularity is not a pre-existing definition of a substance, of an identity, or something like that. I hope that answers the question a little bit. So the question was, if phase transitioning constitutes a sort of standing out from in a pre-individual context, what are the conditions of this standing out, and are we back in a conceptual mode? If you refer to concepts like Simondon appears to do in his introduction as something that relates to pre-existing definitions, eternal essences, then no, we're not back to this. We're on the contrary, we're looking at a process, at an operation whose resulting hexeities can neither be reduced to something that came before or that could have been defined before, nor can they be fully predicted. So, so it's a political question, 100%. I think so. ethical and political. So Georgia asks, I was about to say some aesthetic or even spiritual examples might make it easier to get your head around it, or it does for me anyway. So this is, I don't know exactly what moment of the conversation it refers to, but
it was when Lynn was asking about how do we like predefine phases, and you brought up music, so that was it. I'm thinking about how it's very liquid instead of getting kind of like bogged down in sort of like the scientific terminology around it. I think just put it into a different field. That's what that was about.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's actually what Simondon's system allows for as well. Am I running out of time? Yes, already 5:30. I think we're going to have to leave it here with the comments. If someone could be so kind, maybe Reda, if you could kindly copy and paste all the comments into something on the Discord channel, then you can remind me of it next time if we don't come back to it. And yeah, I'm going to have to leave you now soon, but I wanted to say a few closing things about the presentations. Some of the things we stopped to discuss today would make a really good topics for presentations. For those of you who haven't seen people do presentations at the New Center yet, or who haven't done one yet, don't be daunted by it. In general, what each of you bring to the conversation with your own backgrounds and interests and creativity is immensely illuminating for everybody else. The difficulty of the text itself shouldn't be a barrier, but rather everybody's best attempt at grappling with this difficulty also paves the way for everybody else to think, we can all find our own ways of access. So it really matters a lot to me to have the presentations as a kind of active, integral part of it. And I've learned so much from the presentations in the other seminars. It just, adds many more dimensions. I think Reda has already created a folder where you can enter your name on a date that suits you. You can make your presentation about the text that was scheduled for that session. But you don't have to. You can make your presentation about something that comes from your own field using the concepts of Simondon that we've already discussed and that you're confident using, or, connecting it with your readings of Simondon that cohere ideally a little bit with the session in which you're giving your presentation. You can give your presentations in teams of 2 to 3 people. Each presentation can take up to 20 minutes. So if it's 2 or 3 of you, your collective presentation would take up to 20 minutes. We should have hopefully three presentations roughly per session. That means 1 hour of the session after the break will be dedicated to the presentations, and if we can compress things further, half an hour at the end should be there for loose ends, discussions, and so forth. But make the best of the presentations. There's also a lot of you in the seminar. I think we're over 30. I don't know if all of the people who are present here have signed up for credits and will do presentations and essays. But if there's lots of you doing it, don't wait until we kind of have to cram 20 presentations into the last sessions. And don't be shy, don't be daunted by it. Even if you make a really short one of 5 minutes, it's going to be great for me and great for everybody else. So maybe, we'll leave it with essays. Perhaps you will, those of you who signed up for credits, you're going to write an essay at the end of it that, will I think I put the specifications for that in the syllabus. It's a 3,000 word essay. It doesn't have to be an academic type essays, although if you do, I'll give comments in the margins to kind of help you bring the best out of it. I've also had really beautiful contributions that were written in a kind of autofiction style or poetic styles. Some people have submitted visual material, film, for instance, or sound material. So there's a really wide margin about how creative you want to be with what you submit as a kind of final not final work for the new center for when your whole program finishes, but the kind of essay at the end of this. And yeah, I think we can talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the seminar. But I look forward to introductions next week, next session, and it's going to be great. And thank you very much for chipping in and making this session so dynamic and interesting. Really nice to see familiar faces, and very happy to meet some new people too.
Thank you, Cécile.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Peace.
It's my pleasure. It's my
Thank
pleasure.
you.
It was a great
Thank you.
session.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Have a happy Easter as well, everyone.
Oh,
Whoever is, or
take care,
whatever else
everybody.
you're celebrating now. Bye, everyone.